Thank you, Ilana. And Eric Davis, if you can hear me from your Zen meditation retreat right now, wherever that is, thank you for the invitation. Really wonderful to see all of you here tonight. I want to just do like a couple sort of prefaces to this. One is what Ilana was saying about this being a pan-spiritual place. That's very exciting to me. I teach at the Graduate Theological Union, which is this super robustly interreligious, culturally diverse place. So I love teaching in contexts like that. And one of the things I enjoy about it is seeing the tradition that I study and that I come from myself through the fresh eyes of people for whom this material might be completely new, even if you're Jewish, right? Even if you're, as Ramdas said, Jewish on your parents' side, this material might be totally new to you. So if there are terms that I use at some point that you want to ask about, or if you have some like fresh insights into these sources that we're going to jump into today, I really am excited to be in conversation with everyone in this group, and consider yourself very welcome here. And in that vein, this feels like more of a frontal format than I'm used to. But despite it, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, feel free to raise your hand and jump in. And I want some of that dynamism in the room. And if we're like getting super sidetracked, I'll just say so and steam forward. But I'm excited to hear people's thoughts and questions as we go. Okay. The main place that I want to begin is just also naming a discomfort that I feel myself talking about joy right now. I think we can probably all agree that in some shape or form we live in dark times. And I think particularly as a Jewish person right now, for me at least, this is not a joyful time. It's a vulnerable time. It's a time when, from a place of vulnerability, people in the name of my tradition are inflicting unspeakable, horrific violence upon other people. And when I shared a few ideas with Eric about, these are some different possibilities where we could go, and he was like, joy in Hasidic mysticism. And there was a part of me that was like, ooh, now? And I just want to name that. But in a way, I think it makes it an especially fertile context for going into some of this territory and exploring these grounds. Just to be clear from the outset, when we're talking about joy tonight in the Hasidic context, and I'll explain what Hasidism is shortly. Just to be clear, what we're not talking about hedonism. We're not talking about like prioritizing one's own pleasure as an end in itself. We're also in talking about joy. We're not talking about like looking away from pain or suffering in the world or in ourselves, for that matter. I'm reminded of this story that I love, and it might not be true. It might be apocryphal. I'm not sure, about Thich Nhat Hanh, where one day he walked into the San Francisco Zen Center back in the day and saw all these very like austere Bay Area Buddhists like walking very slowly and carefully and like following their breath. And he walked in and just said, I'm leaving and I'm not coming back until people start laughing. And Thich Nhat Hanh famously is like, Martin Luther King nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a huge activist coming from his home country of Vietnam in the context of the war and beyond. And so the kind of joy, right, that we're talking about here is not, it's not that hedonism. It's not like to sort of like shield one's eyes from pain and discomfort. It's something much deeper than that. And what we'll see, I'll just give the spoiler from the beginning as sort of a through line or a thesis for where we're going, that in Hasidism, the opposite of joy is not sadness or concern. The opposite of joy is paralysis, exhaustion, and above all, self-absorption as the opposite of the kind of joy that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so what the hell is Hasidism? This is an early modern Eastern European Jewish mystical movement. It really started to percolate in like the middle of the 1700s and was really off the ground. Many people sort of date the real sort of rocketing of it in around 1772, and partly because that's when it was banned by most of the rabbinic authorities at the time. This was a very radical, revolutionary, sort of countercultural movement within the world of Jewish spirituality in this context. That might sound surprising given what perhaps our image of Hasidism in the world is today, which is one of the most ultra-conservative extremist, perhaps one of the most insular movements, perhaps one of the most patriarchal movements in Jewish history. That is how it got from where its roots were to what it looks like today. If you're in Brooklyn or Jerusalem or other places, is for another night. But just to be clear, we're talking about the first generations of Hasidism here when it emerged. So for our purposes, to kind of set up this landscape for thinking about joy in Hasidism, I want to just highlight a few aspects of what this thing was and how it emerged when it did. So first of all, as one might imagine, like in the 18th century in these Christian Eastern European lands, the sort of dominant approach to piety and spirituality tended to be pretty ascetic. Both, in maybe sort of ascetic light ways of like fasting and being sort of very scrupulous and meticulous in one's practice, but also in more sort of blatant ways. Sometimes even like sort of self-abnegation, self-laceration, self-harm, like in some of the more extreme forms of practice at this time. And in Hasidism was, among other things, a backlash against that sort of ascetic approach to spirituality. And one of the sort of central slogans of this movement is quoting Psalms, which says, "Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha," serve God in joy. Right? Joy should not be regarded as something that's somehow antithetical to spiritual life or a distraction or something that sort of diverts the direction of your soul. Joy is actually the engine, right? This is actually where the rubber hits the road in your spiritual connection and your spiritual life. That was a quite controversial approach, especially in the way that they pursued that, as we'll see. It's also just helpful, I think, to locate Hasidism in the history of Jewish mysticism, because it was also a backlash in some ways against earlier medieval Kabbalah, earlier medieval Jewish mysticism. And I'm thinking especially of this 16th century variety, sometimes called Lurianic Kabbalah, which had grown, just to paint this in broad strokes, had grown very elaborate and very complicated. It involved these things called kavanot, or intentions, that made one's prayer practice. Traditionally, Jews pray 3 times a day, in the morning, afternoon, and evening. And it made the prayer practice extremely complex and intricate. And Hasidism was one of the things that animated its approach to prayer and its approach to religious practice more broadly was a simplifying of those systems, and locating it not in having all the esoteric secrets, getting all of these little details right, but actually having something that's of the heart. So a very famous, sort of often told story attributed to the very founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, who died in 1760, just to plot him on a map, is comparing all of those kavanot, all of those intentions of medieval Kabbalah, to like a huge ring of keys. And to open the gates of prayer, you need to know exactly which key to use when and put it exactly in the right hole in the precise order. And the Baal Shem Tov taught, we don't use the ring of keys. We take an axe and we break the fucking gate open. And the way that we break it open is with the breaking open of the heart. So this is a pretty tectonic shift in the approach of Jewish mysticism and the nature of practice. And even also sort of associated with this, there's a shift away in Hasidic mysticism from an emphasis on like the scholarly elite. The scholar historically in Judaism, the Talmid Chacham, is historically like a sort of pinnacle role to play in a community. But Hasidism celebrated rather the tamim, the simple person. Sometimes even people who were illiterate, people who did not have a traditional Jewish education, but were sort of celebrated as actually having an even more sort of immediate, direct capacity to be flush with divinity. The idea that scholarship and being in the head and being very meticulous in your thinking can actually be obstacles to spiritual connection. So this gives you a sense of some of the sort of contours of Hasidic mysticism, and we'll see how joy plays into this. Please.
Could you say a little about what mystical or mysticism means, how it's understood?
Great question.
Yeah.
So the question is, I was told to maybe repeat questions in case people online can't hear. Question is, what is mystical? This word that I keep using. It's not a word that would have been recognizable to the Hasidim themselves at all. The modern Hebrew term for mysticism, mystika, is just drawn from other languages in modern times. When I'm using that term, it's a term that is essentially traditions within Judaism that place special emphasis on the personal connection to the divine. And these get very blurry, and some of the scholarship I work on is like trying to like throw out the term mystical also, even though I'm still using it here. As opposed to sort of strictly legalistic approaches or strictly like philosophical approaches that might be more in like the realm of logic and reason and argumentation, what sometimes are called mystical traditions are traditions that sort of place that special emphasis on the personal, emotional, bodily, experiential experience of God. And often have an emphasis on a sort of unitive experience, an experience of oneness with the divinity, God being somehow inseparable from everything, but not necessarily, at least in the history of Jewish mysticism. One last thing, just contextualizing Hasidism before we jump into sources. There are debates about like, is this a movement that emerged out of crisis? And there's all scholars like weigh in on this in different ways, but there is no denying the fact that these Jewish communities in this Eastern European context in the 18th century into the 19th century did experience immense poverty and persecution. And in turning to thinking about joy in Hasidism, joy as this like foundational core value in this tradition, it is worth sort of bearing in mind, like, was this some way of navigating those contexts? Okay. So let's hop in here. Thanks for sitting with the history there. So let's turn to source one here. And I want to begin with a relatively familiar idea of joy, which is like laughing and having fun. So this is from one of the earliest published books in Hasidic tradition. You can see it's printed in 1794 originally. And this is attributed to the Besht, which is an acronym for the Baal Shem Tov. That guy who I mentioned is remembered as being the founder of Hasidism. So a teaching from the Besht about the matter of, quote, a joke before learning, which is just taking this phrase from the Talmud, classical rabbinic literature from late antiquity, and this idea that the rabbis of ancient times used to tell jokes before studying. So the Besht is weighing in on this idea of a joke before learning, and then cites a different source. This is from the first chapter of Ezekiel, where the prophet Ezekiel in the Hebrew Bible is having this wild psychedelic vision of a like eyeball-studded chariot in the sky with fiery creature wings all around it, and some semblance of God sitting in the middle of his chariot. And Ezekiel reported in that vision the chayot, literally in his context, the animals run and retreat. They come forward and they go back. The animals are like ebbing and flowing, wow, 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 in this wild vision that Ezekiel is having. But the Baal Shem Tov pronounces those 4 letters of chayot just with different pronunciation, with different vowels that aren't even in the original source anyway, as chiyut, which means life force or vitality. So he's quoting this: the divine life force runs and retreats, it ebbs and it flows. And human beings are in the mystery of constriction and expansion. These are like key ideas in Hasidic spirituality, katnus and gadlus, literally like smallness and bigness, that we have expansive states of consciousness, and then we have more like narrow states of consciousness. And that's seeing here, that's a measure of like how attuned to the divine life force pulsating in all being are we in this moment. And he goes on, through joy and jokes, constriction turns into expansion, so we may learn in a way that is flush with blessed divinity. So on one hand, this is a familiar portrayal of joy. Joy is telling jokes. Joy is laughing. Joy is lightening up. But we're seeing already here, there's something else going on here. What happens in our bodies, in our psyches, when we laugh and tell jokes, he's suggesting, is we expand our consciousness. We open the valve of our awareness for the divine life force that is surging in all being. That's what happens when we're laughing. And so we're seeing here that what might be something familiar is also being defamiliarized at the same time. Any questions or thoughts at this point?
Can you tell us a joke?
I did just hear a joke that my friend's dad told me the other day that I think is kind of funny. What's the difference between outlaws and in-laws? Outlaws are wanted. Yeah, I love my in-laws, but I still think it's funny. Yeah.
I guess maybe we're going to go deeper into it. The idea of this joke being bigger and like a gateway to spirituality, and like kind of what a connection to higher being, to God. I don't feel like I quite see that connection yet, though.
Right. I don't think we see it in here, and that's what we're about to go deeper into right now. Right. So that's the heart of the matter. Why? Why, when we laugh, would that be a mechanism of like expanding our spiritual consciousness? And what we'll see here is part of it is that it takes us outside of ourselves. It's hard to laugh when you're like super self-conscious. It's hard to laugh when you're sort of like making sure you don't do anything sort of out of step in some way. So this is where we're going to get into some of the implications for Hasidic practice. And this is where we'll see that joy actually becomes one of the like controversial aspects of Hasidism. One of the reasons why the sort of major rabbinic authorities at the time tried to excommunicate them and failed, and Hasidism spread like wildfire. So let's turn to source 2 here. So this is, again, a teaching attributed to the Baal Shem Tov himself, the founder of Hasidism. And says sometimes the evil urge will deceive you. The Yetzer Hara, the evil urge, is something that comes up in Jewish sources throughout the tradition. And I often translate it as ego, because that seems to be like what it generally means. But it can, in different contexts, it can mean different things. So evil urge will deceive you, saying, you've committed a great sin, even though it was just a common slip up or not even a sin at all. Its intention, so the intention of this Yetzer Hara, this evil urge, is to cast you into depression, which will prevent you from serving the blessed Creator. You must understand this trap and say to the evil urge, I will not scrutinize this slip up that you're talking about. Your intention is to prevent me from serving God. You're speaking lies. And even if there really is a little transgression, it will bring more delight to my Creator if I don't scrutinize this slip up. You're only telling me about it to bring depression into my practice. But no, I will serve God with joy, right? There's that line from the Psalms. I will serve God with joy. This is a core principle, because the intention of my practice is not to attend to myself, but rather to delight the Blessed One. So here we see something really interesting happening, right? This is like, you have committed a great sin for like the sort of dominant spiritual sensibilities of the 1740s, 1750s, when the Baal Shem Tov was sort of attracting his circle. Like, that would be a very righteous thing to say to yourself, right? You've committed a great sin. It's time to repent, right? This is like now comes the spiritual work. And he's saying, no, exactly the opposite, right? That voice, that like scrutinizing, self-critical voice, is actually distracting you from God and keeping you locked within your own shit inside, right? This is something that's going to make you depressed. This is something that's going to make you sad, actually. And and as we all know, to varying degrees, like when you're depressed, you're actually unable to serve. Especially in the way that he's thinking about it, in like ritual practice, in like being in community and having a kind of vitality in your practice, that it can sort of like wall you up within yourself. And so that last line there is key. This is a core principle, because the intention of my practice is not to attend to myself, but rather to delight the Blessed One. And if anyone knows like a little Yiddish from my grandma or something, the word that I translate here is delight. It's naches, which is like something that, it's like a word that is especially is used for a sort of parental delight in relation to your kids. Like, I feel like I had such naches, right, when I saw you doing this. So like, if you're so serious in the practice and beating yourself up, your Creator won't feel that naches, and you're depriving them of that. Let's look at one more, just to sort of continue to like throw some logs on the fire of this idea of practice. Yeah. Or sorry, you haven't asked the question yet. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So this question, the intention of my practice is to delight the Blessed One. So on the one hand, we have joy as the animating principle of the individual. On the other, like the Creator experiencing delight. Where does that notion sit in the traditional or the prevailing notions of the time? Because I know there's like, with respect to like sacrifices in temple times, delighting God, that was like the central ritual. But how was that situated? Was that part of the prevailing understanding of the point of religious practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right. So this idea that the one of the essential purposes of practice is to bring this delight to the divine. Like, how traditional even is that idea? It's very traditional. It's not to say that that's exclusive, but generally, like how Jews for millennia have imagined the emotional life of God in relation to them and their practice typically is like the spectrum of emotions that we would associate with a parent. So there's a lot of stuff about joy, as you mentioned, like the reach nichoach, like the pleasing aroma of the sacrifices in the Torah, and through this sort of transformation of that tradition in rabbinic Judaism, there's a lot of stuff about bringing pleasure, bringing delight. There's a lot of stuff about love, right? That these are expressions of love, which I think also has a valence of like pleasure and delight and connection. And there's a lot of stuff around like anger and trying to get forgiveness. I'd say that's the dimension that probably feels most distant to this image of, oh God, we like really fucked up in the past, or maybe yesterday, or maybe just now, and we are trying to regain your favor. It's to regain that love and to like regenerate that delight. But there's also a lot of that. And you can imagine like different generations, different communities in different centuries and different regions emphasize sort of one or the other of those sides.
The last two words, blessed one, are catching my attention.
Yeah.
And even your capitalization is interesting. Right? Lowercase b and capital.
Yeah. I'll also just say that the Hebrew there is just it's just lefanav yitbarach shemo, which is before him, blessed is the name. So that would be like the most literal translation. But it's like but the him is just literally one letter at the end of the word before in the Hebrew. So they're basically like not saying the name. So I just say the blessed one.
Okay, can you say the literal translation?
The most literal translation would be before him, blessed be his name. Yeah, which is a mouthful. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at one more, I think, related source about thinking about joy in practice here. So this next source 3, takes place on Purim, which is like the quintessential holiday on the Jewish calendar that is associated with joy. And on this holiday, part of what is done is you read Megillat Esther, you read the scroll of Esther. And that's what's happening in this scene with this particular Hasidic leader named, he's called the Seraph of Mogilnich, but Seraph is a kind of angel. So during the reading of the scroll of Esther on Purim, which the Seraph himself read, a devout and God-fearing yeshiva student, so a student of traditional Jewish texts, who's God-fearing, which traditionally has a positive connotation. To be yirat shamayim, to be God-fearing, typically is like a compliment. Here, we're going to see that it's actually not. So this devout and God-fearing yeshiva student stood next to him, to the Seraph, looking at his scroll. After the reading, the yeshiva student said, "I fear that I might not have heard well and thus missed a word that I did not hear." The Seraph said, "This is from." From is like a Yiddish word for piety, for pious. This is what from is. One who is, and again, a word that usually in these very traditional communities would have a positive connotation, but here we'll see that it's not. One who is from, one who's pious, just wants to comply with the commandment. So he fears, for example, that he did not complete the 18 benedictions, right? He did not read, for example, like every one of the 18 prayers in the Amidah prayer and the daily prayers. But the essential intention, right, contrary to what this God-fearing from guy is trying to do, the essential intention is to fulfill the will of God. So your will yearns for the will of God that is within the commandment. And you must cleave so much to the will of God within the commandment that you will be able to err. You will be able to mess up a bit sometimes in the content of the commandment. As it's written, and this is quoting this verse from Proverbs, you'll see that they're always, it's this very like citational tradition. As it's written, in her love, you will always err. The Hebrew here of err, of always err, is tishke tamid. Again, another Yiddish word that might sound familiar to some, mashugana. crazy, like you've lost your shit, like sometimes having almost like an intoxicated kind of valence to it. So in her love, referring here to the Shekhinah, to the divine feminine, which could be a whole other class in Jewish mysticism. But in her love, you'll mess up. You'll be so ravished in love that you'll go a little crazy, right? You'll sort of lose your mind a little bit. And so the seraph is saying here that, right, he's drawing this distinction between this God-fearing yeshiva bocher, this like traditional student who's trying to like dot every I and cross every T in his practice. And he's saying this kind of piety is where you are trying to get everything right for yourself. You're missing God, right? God is in the commandment, right? And the way to access that divine sort of spiritual marrow of the practice is to actually let go and celebrate Purim, the festival of joy. Like, have fun here and open yourself to the like full dynamism of what's happening here. And in that way, you might actually end up messing up. You might miss things. You might like mispronounce something or whatever it is. But in that openness, opening up, in that self-transcendence, getting out of your own head, getting out of your own sort of like compulsion to do everything right, there you're getting to the real stuff of spiritual life. You can see how this might have been controversial, and why Hasidim gained a sort of reputation among traditionalist Jews of the time as being somehow a threat to tradition. And it's worth just noting, so one of the most wonderful, weird, untold stories in Jewish history. Has anyone heard of Shabbatai Tzvi, Sabbatianism? Okay, so like this footnote I think is worth it here to give a sense of what's going on in Hasidism here. Shabbatai Tzvi in the year 1666 like was the Messiah. This guy like had hundreds of thousands of Jews from like as far east as like modern day Iraq and as far west as like places in Western Europe, literally selling their belongings and packing up their stuff to follow Shabbatai Tzvi, who, among other things, sort of sanctified the breaking of Jewish law. And said we're entering an era with a new Torah, and where it says thou shall, we're reading it as thou shalt not. We're inverting everything. We're opening up to a new Torah, and had this very like radical antinomian sort of against the law sort of vitality to what he was doing. And he got like more and more sort of provocative in his practice as he went. And eventually, just to make a long story short, set sail with like many of his followers to Constantinople to go see the Sultan to announce that it was time for the Jewish people to fulfill messianic promises. And they were, because this is Palestine, Jerusalem was all the land of Israel was under Ottoman control at this time, and was like coming to say, we're here to take over. And no one knows exactly what happens, but basically he was, Shabbatai Tzvi himself, not long thereafter that, ended up converting to Islam. And it became, at the time, like in the 1660s, this enormous debacle and embarrassment for the Jewish world. It's part of the reason why, like, I only saw a couple hands of people, like, Jews did not tell this story. But there remains this whole crypto-Sabbatian tradition throughout Turkey and even and in Poland. There was this big wave, and that movement, almost a full century later, in the middle of the 18th century, there was this like big orgy that happened. Sexuality and breaking sexual transgressions was like a very important part of the Sabbatian movement. And there was something happening with Chaya Shor, who was the daughter of a Sabbatian rabbi who was mostly naked, but wearing Torah crowns, dressed as a Torah with some sort of like erotic ceremony happening. And word of this got out to Christians, and that's where things really got dicey. And once the Christian authorities heard about the and it maybe involved a crucifix also in the ceremony, because like Shabbatai Tzvi had converted to Islam, and so like the Polish Jews in Christian lands, it had this sort of syncretistic something going on. But anyway, there was around this time, around the very time that Hasidism emerged, there was a huge just slamming down of Sabbateanism in this Eastern European Jewish sphere, excommunicating them, but like tons of polemics against them. And so one of the things that some people think about like this, what Hasidism is doing with practice, right? Because we've seen what seems to be like kind of a lenience towards the letter of the law, right? In some of these, like in tapping into joy, it's like, it's okay if you mess up a little bit. That on some level, what they were maybe something that was happening here is they were trying to sort of find some like middle ground between sort of classical rabbinic Jewish tradition and what had captured so many hearts and souls of the Jewish world in Sabbateanism, in saying, okay, we're not going to be antinomian. We're not going to promote blatant violations and throwing out of our traditional practices, but we're going to try to tap into something that is empowering, inspiring, like bold, like feels personal, that's arousing on some level, even like within the traditional practice itself. We could say it's not antinomian, but it's what we see in that last text from the Seraph. It's metanomian, right? It's if nomos is the law. It's like whether you do the law or you don't do the law, like out of this binary, what we want to talk about is what is at the heart of practice is something that is not the law. So whether you're saying do the law or don't do the law, like you're just thinking so much about the law. Think about God, right? Think about what it means to be spiritually connected. And for Hasidim, joy was at the heart of illuminating that, what they considered to be this heart of practice. Any questions before we go on? Yeah, please.
It just strikes me that these are two very different versions of God. One is a God that's terrifying and that you should be afraid of. And the other is a God that you should delight and celebrate and be joyful with.
And where are you seeing the terrifying God to be afraid of?
Well, I mean, just in the description of the student.
Right.
And where does it say that?
Yeah, no, like right, this God-fearing, pious student.
You know, the God that we hear about, you know, killing little babies on Passover and like like God can be really pretty scary.
Yeah.
And ruthless.
Right.
And so I don't know.
Totally. No, that's a really important observation.
Yeah.
To appreciate the distance of this God from a sort of like domineering, even like violent, vengeful sort of image of what a lot of my Christian students at the GTU refer to as the God of the Old Testament. Sort of just like harping on sort of particular portrayals. And I would say just in short that God in Hasidism, most places where you see in these early Hasidic sources, people talking about God, what it means to be in relation to God, it hardly even seems like a deity anymore. God is often associated with that chiyut, that life, that divine life force pulsating in everything. God is inseparable from people and practice and the earth. So when you have that kind of totally radically revised understanding of divinity, it's not to say that divine can't also be really scary. I mean, if anyone's had psychedelic experiences, for example, where it feels like you're in the presence of something that is like the sort of beating heart of the universe in some way. It's not necessarily going to be pleasant or delightful, but right, it's very different. So it's worth pointing that out. Yeah.
In the broader historical context of this, the metanomian position here, it feels very, I know maybe not historically exactly the same, but it feels very reminiscent of Buddhist Tantra, right? Of a, and I'm just curious, like maybe it feels like around that time, right, after the birth of many of these traditions in this sort of axial age tradition of maybe at some point being kind of burdened with a lot of tradition, and like, oh, within the tantric tradition, right, rather than turning away from the senses, saying, oh, maybe that's the path. And I know the parallel is not exact, but I'm curious about the thoughts about kind of some kind of broader historical shift away from, this is the way, to like, oh, maybe the way is not the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is always one of the things that's so fascinating about studying any spiritual tradition is you start, especially traditions, is you start seeing these parallels. And I mean, on one hand, perhaps there's just similar sensibilities that can arise in the human spirit, right? No matter where in the world you are, what tradition you're from, that we see in different traditions. Sometimes we go really dark and like self lacerating, and sometimes there's going to be like a backlash against that's going to sort of seek out this different way. At the same time, and this is just like another footnote to throw in here, there can be like the lines of influence are very hard to trace, but we do know that they're there. So in this case, Hasidic mysticism of 18th century Eastern Europe would not have emerged except being downstream from earlier movements of Jewish mysticism, especially going back into 13th century Spain, which in turn was being influenced by sort of philosophical, mystical trends before that in Islamic Spain. And Jewish mysticism was deeply influenced, like transformed. Jewish spirituality and philosophy was profoundly transformed by the encounter with Sufism, with the mystical branch of Islam, which itself had origins much farther east in ways that there actually are people who have traced like Buddhist sources that had been translated into Arabic that were read by Arabic-speaking Jews living in the Islamic lands of the Iberian Peninsula, who translated those into Judeo-Arabic, which were eventually translated into Hebrew, and unbeknownst to the people transmitting these traditions, like where there are smoking gun cases where it's like, that's a Buddhist source in an 18th century Hasidic book. So, right. Yeah, please.
So just to pick up on that, I'm curious how closely the Hasidic tradition and practice that we've been discussing fuse to modern day Hasidic practice, because this is not what I think of.
No.
I think of, this idea of self-acceptance and joy and a little bit of subversion and playful.
Yeah.
Is very different.
Very different. So. Super different. And yeah, so early, and I don't want to paint it in like too contrasting ways. Like early Hasidism was lovingly devoted to the traditional Jewish practices. So I don't want to give the wrong impression when they're talking about, like, let it go, like in practice, they were still, in many ways, they were seeing this as a renewal of the tradition. But to your point, there is a huge contrast here between the ethos and the messages here and what we would associate with the sort of ultra-conservative approaches of contemporary Hasidim. And really, that change happened already starting in the 19th century. And when Hasidism really sort of emerged, partly because it was so controversial and there were these writs of excommunication against it. So the rabbinic opponents of Hasidism, called misnagdim, literally the ones who are against the Hasidim and the misnagdim for like decades were like clashing and butting heads against each other. But already just within a few generations, they started together looking west and looking around them and seeing all of these modernizing, assimilating liberal forces of the Enlightenment and of modernization, and realizing, oh shit, we have other people who are way more threatening to what they understood to be Jewish tradition and the life of Torah than we are between ourselves. And to like essentially the Hasidim and the Misnagdim like joined forces, and Hasidism actually in some ways really like took the steering wheel of what comes to be understood as ultra orthodoxy. So, you know, historical circumstances shape spiritual movements, and we see that in Hasidism.
But these subversive texts are still canonical, right? The Baal Shem Tov is still like part of the menu.
Right? Which is interesting, right? Right. And this is where Alana mentioned that in the introduction, I'm interested in hermeneutics. I'm interested in interpretation, right? So we can see like, how do you interpret these texts that we're reading? You could interpret them in very subversive, radical ways, or they could be interpreted in ways where it's like, oh, they don't literally mean this. Like this is what they really mean. And so how we interpret these sources, you know, plays an essential role in what they're saying. Okay, so let's keep moving forward here. The past couple sources have really helped us think about practice, and specifically about relation to God, right? The past couple sources helped us see, right, the opposite of joy is not sadness. The opposite of joy is self-absorption. We saw that in the Baal Shem Tov saying, you know, my practice is not about attending to myself. My practice is about opening up to God. And we see the Seraph saying, like, your practice shouldn't be about just like you fulfilling your duties. It should be about you getting out of yourself and tapping into something much, much bigger and much holier. But there's another facet to this, which is it's not only like overcoming self-absorption into a place of joy is not only about opening oneself to God or to the essence of practice. It's also about opening oneself to other people, right? It's also about being open and attuned in the world. And so we see that here in source 4. So this takes place at a wedding, right? The last source took place on the holiday of Purim, which is a sort of quintessential holiday of joy. This takes place at a wedding, which is a quintessential occasion of joy. And we see here a story. The day after the rabbi and tzaddik, which is a word for like a Hasidic leader, the day after the rabbi and tzaddik, Chaim of Zantz, married his son off to the daughter of the holy Rabbi Eliezer of Chikov, he said to him, "Look at me, brother-in-law. My head, hair, and beard have gone gray, but I still have not come to repentance." The holy rabbi of Chikov responded, "You have only yourself in mind. Forget yourself. It's better to have the world in mind." And so we see here again, like, as we've seen, this line, we can call it like virtue signaling, maybe, or maybe it's even like a more authentic thing. Like maybe this rabbi really is like in touch with his mortality and seeing his body aging, and maybe he is feeling like genuinely haunted on some level by the fact that he's like still so imperfect and fallible, and he feels like he hasn't like gotten to where he wants to be spiritually, right? And again, like in many moments of the tradition, in other streams, even in this time period, that might be seen as like a deeply praiseworthy sort of posture to take on. Wow, like even at your kid's wedding, you are so clocked into your spiritual life that you're concerned with how unenlightened you are. Like that is humility. But it's the exact opposite here, right? The message is get out of your head, like dance. What are you doing? This is your kid's wedding. And specifically the concern is forget yourself. It's better to have the world in mind in Yiddish here at the end of the source. Any thoughts, observations, questions that at this juncture here.
So I find this content thrilling. If I wasn't familiar with Hasidism, I would like find a Hasidic temple to go to on a Friday. Does this exist anywhere?
It's a great question. Generally speaking, again, it's interesting that this keeps coming up, right? Because I think a lot of us like have this image of Hasidism from as long as we've been alive, all of us in this room, and it's very different from this. So generally speaking, the short answer, speaking as an outsider, I should say, is no. It seems to generally no. Like Hasidism has, but like the world is complicated, right? Even some of the most ultra conservative movements, like I don't want to be a sort of secularist fundamentalist and imagine and fall into the sort of Netflix pitfall of like, whenever I talk about Hasidism or any sort of like religious movement, I have to put it in this sort of binary black and white category of like imprisonment here, liberation here. So I'm sure that these traditions of emphasizing joy and a sense that like depression can be dangerous for practice. Like, yeah, there's still a ton of dancing. There's still a ton of singing. But I will say in general, right, this is more foreign to the Hasidic world in really since like fairly early in the 19th century than it was in its origins. Except one, I'd say, interesting exception probably is Breslov Hasidism, which we're actually going to turn to some sources from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who was a great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. And to this day, like you could be in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv and see vans like spray painted on the side, blasting like EDM music with Breslov Hasidim dancing around, like raving in the streets and trying to bring people into this sphere. It's no coincidence that that's one of the only Hasidic dynasties where there hasn't been a living leader. There hasn't been a living Rebbe of Breslov Hasidism since Rebbe Nachman of Breslov died in, I think it was 1810 or 1811. So, dad's out of town. And that's like really an exception to the rule. So. Okay. All right, let's look at some more here. So just to sort of sum up where we're at, right? Like joy doesn't distract us from the world, but the exact opposite is what we're seeing in these sources. Joy actually gets us out of ourselves, out of our heads, and in a sort of greater attunement to the world, to the divine, to what we're doing in our spiritual practice. And we have maybe what could be felt to be like a paradox of sorts, that excessive piety actually can, at its psychological core, be a kind of self-absorption, right? I think that's something that's like a real motif here. That when we get, and I kind of feel like this is what Thich Nhat Hanh, at least if this story is true, like must have been talking about in the Zen Center. Like you're all a little too into your practice and getting everything right, and in doing that, you're in here, right? You're not. There's no flow. There's no movement. There's no vitality in what you're doing. But so a question, like a practical question, is okay. So let's say that, I have a tendency to get a little too serious, to take myself too seriously and bring a kind of like, I don't know, intensity to my practices. And so a question is, well, how do you break out of that? How do I break out of that? And so I want to turn here to a source about joyful foolishness. So Rebbe Nachman, who I just mentioned, the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism, is quoted saying, I'll just say the Yiddish because it's just got such a good sound to it. "Me ken mehr nit freilich sein, nor mit narrisch machen sich." You can't be joyful without making yourself a fool, right? Sometimes you just have to act like an ass in order to break out of your intense sort of austere state and get to a place of joy. And so for me, one of the most beautiful and illuminating sources on this is from the Piasetzner Rebbe, sometimes known as the Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe. So we're actually jumping far. We're into the 20th century here. Kalonymus Kalman Shapira of Piasetzno was at the end of his life the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, until he was murdered there and buried. His teachings at the time, they were found after the war and published as Eish Kodesh, as the Holy Fire. This is actually from a teaching of his before the war, when he was just a Hasidic leader in Warsaw at the time. And here again, I'll just give the context of what holiday we're talking about here. This holiday, where this story, this is source 5, takes place, is called Simchat Torah, literally the joy of Torah. And it's an annual festival. It's actually not long from now, where in the annual cycle of Torah readings, you finish reading the Torah. You read the last part of Deuteronomy, and then in the same breath, you start the very beginning of "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And it's a holiday, as the name of it suggests, Joy of Torah, of like just a profound celebration. You can imagine this would be like an important vibe, an important occasion for Hasidism. So let's see what a story that the Piasetzner Rebbe himself tells about this Simchat Torah. Why was I so affected when I decided to somersault at the dedication of the Torah scroll on Simchat Torah? It's worth mentioning that somersaulting during prayer, and even like in the streets and at weird times, was actually one of the most sort of like recognizable practices among the early Hasidim. It was like the opponents of Hasidism. This is something they loved to talk about. It's like, these dudes are somersaulting in synagogue. And so this is, so it's not quite as random as it sounds when the Piasetzner Rebbe is saying, why was I so affected when I decided to somersault at the dedication of the Torah scroll on Simchat Torah? Why do my bones tingle and my whole body quake so much whenever I see the place where I danced and flipped? Jews are often filled with a powerful yearning that exceeds their level of Torah study and worship, right? We're often filled with this yearning where it's like, I haven't studied or mastered enough to like somehow contain what I want to express and connect to right now. They say to themselves, what can I do that is powerful and spicy for the sake of God? Then their hearts sink. What good are my Torah and my worship or my practice? They do not satisfy my soul. So from this place of yearning, this like feeling of despondency can set in. I think probably a lot of us know that place. When I began to prepare myself for the conclusion of the Torah reading, an even more intense yearning ignited within me, flaring up like fire. Might a moment of such holy and awesome joy happen only once in my life? What can I do in it with my body for God? I can dance and rejoice with all my might, like the normal Hasidic stuff, fine, but my soul still won't be satisfied. This is not the powerful and spicy act that matches such a holy, exalted, and unique hour. I said, I shall somersault like those lowly people who debase themselves in order to bring joy to their master, right? So he's like, you can tell that at least at this point in the history of Hasidism, like in, I think this is the 1920s, when he originally wrote this, 1930s, that at this point, like somersaulting at this point in the Hasidic world is associated with like the masses. If you're the Rebbe of a community, like if you are the sage leader of a community, that's typically not what is appropriate or expected. So, but he's saying, maybe I'll do that thing. But then Satan accused me. What is this service? What's the point of it? Why should God care whether you do flips or not? You might also injure yourself. And won't you look like a madman or a fool in front of everyone? Then my heart roared back. May the Lord rebuke you, Satan. This is no time for heady calculations. It is a great moment, a singular and urgent time. Now I want to do something that delivers my very being to my rock and my creator. And this delivers my very being. This is mesirat nefesh. This is literally like a phrase that's associated with martyrdom. Like I want to die, right? I like a spiritual death here. And I want to do something that delivers my very being to my rock and my creator. Since you, Satan, are trying to concern me with my health and my shame, I know that I've found that spicy act I was searching for. Now I am determined to dedicate myself to it. And this word dedicate is mitkadesh, like literally like to make myself holy through this act. Ever since that foolish act that I came up with has become sacred and special to me, and I dissolve myself before it. Again, this like key term for a kind of spiritual like ego death. This is bitul here. I dissolve myself before it. In my mind, this was not a simple somersault. Something like an altar was glittering before my eyes. Okay.
I'm just curious about Satan.
Yeah, I know. I knew that was going to come up. Like modern, relatively secular-minded Jews loves to say things like, heaven and hell is a Christian thing. Satan's a Christian thing. Maybe even God is a Christian thing. But yeah, there's a lot of Satan in Jewish tradition that went out of fashion for many of us. But here, Satan in the Hebrew literally it means like an obstacle in some way. And it's not clear that it's like the devil in the way that we might think. But Satan is often actually it's like we're seeing something similar here to remember the Yetzer Hara, the evil urge in the Baal Shem Tov story, where it's like it's that voice, whether it's within me or it's some sort of like cosmic principle, but it's that voice that's trying to sort of like veer us away from the good way. And here that's really what Satan is doing here. We could say Satan is again like it's basically his ego, right? He's saying I want to offer myself up and I'm gonna somersault like those like amcha, like those lowly people who debase themselves. And Satan is literally that place. It's like, you might hurt yourself. You might embarrass yourself. Are you worried? Like, what are you even trying to, like, what are you hoping to get out of this, right? It's all of those voices that we all know so well as from this place of like ego and self-protection and self-consciousness and caution. And this is, I think, one of the things that's so striking about this teaching. It's precisely when he hears those kinds of arguments that are all about him, right? All about protecting his reputation, his body, his self-image, that he realizes, aha, I found it. That's the one. If it brings up those voices in my head, like this is the one. And then he repeatedly uses this language of actually like offering himself up, dissolving himself, and so on. And so this is, I think, again, like this very illuminating story for understanding the nature, like what is joy in this tradition? Again, like joy is what happens when we self-transcend in this way. Not necessarily in like an out-of-body experience kind of way, maybe that also. And we certainly see a lot of that in Hasidism, but even in the sense of like when we can be in relation to the world, when we can be in relation to God, when we can be in relation to practice in ways that are out of our heads. Any thoughts? Any questions? Yeah.
What are you translating as spicy?
Harif, which is literally just spicy. Like if you were like ordering a falafel in Tel Aviv, you'd be like harif. So yeah, spicy. Yeah. Okay. One more source, and then we're gonna wrap up, and I'm happy to open it up more for discussion. So I think there can be something simplistic about this. Like, I also find these texts, I think you use the word thrilling, stoked to hear that. I also find these texts thrilling. But then there's also a part of me that's like, yeah, but what about the importance of heartbreak? You know, like, be joyful all the time. Like, what about times such as ours when like there needs to be a place for just for feeling broken, and for some of us even who have maybe like darker dispositions, you know, like what about that side of ourselves? What do we do with that? And I think above all, the person to turn to in the Hasidic tradition for this is, again, this guy, Rebbe Nachman of Bratslav, the originator of a line that currently raves to electronic dance music in the streets. But Rebbe Nachman himself was, like, if he were alive in our culture today, would probably be diagnosed as bipolar. Clearly struggled profoundly with depression, and also clearly had these moments of what, you know, might be like sort of pathologized as mania, but, you know, were his like moments of excitement and illumination and fire in his teaching and his practice. So Rebbe Nachman, I think, is an interesting person for us to turn to at the end here. And this is what he says. This is source 6. Although a broken heart is also very good, this is nonetheless just for a limited time. It's only good if it's sort of like contained in some way, temporally. It is sensible to set aside for yourself some time every day to break open your heart and pour out your thoughts before God, as we've discussed. And when he says, as we've discussed, like, he said that the most important part of his practice is what he called hitbodedut, which literally means solitude. And it's where you go out by yourself, ideally somewhere in like the woods or in a field or something, he says, and you spend an hour in your mother tongue. Like he says, like, just do it in Yiddish, you know, don't use like the sacred tongue and all that. Just like let it out. Just let it out between you and the divine. And even if you don't know what to say, just say that and be there. And here he's locating this time of daily hitbodedut, of daily solitude, daily solitary prayer, really, as this time where, like, if you need to set that time aside to just have a broken heart, do it. But the whole rest of the day needs to be in joy. And again, what he means by joy, I hope, like, we're starting to have a more capacious, nuanced understanding of what he means by that in the sources we've looked at. Because it is all too easy for brokenheartedness to descend into melancholy, or what we might call depression. Far easier than it is for joy to descend into sort of blunder, go easy on us, or debauchery, go easy on us. The go easy on us it's chas v'shalom. It's like a very difficult phrase to translate, but it's basically like, chas is like spare me, shalom is peace. So it's like, I'm going to say, you know, sometimes from a place of joy, we're going to like mess up and we're going to be debaucherous. Like, please go easy on us if and when that happens. But just to clarify what's going on there. So it's all too easy for brokenheartedness to descend into melancholy, far easier than it is for joy to descend into some sort of blunder or debauchery. It's more likely that a broken heart will lead to melancholy. So there must always be joy. Just designate a special time for brokenheartedness. And again, this is like, clearly Rebbe Nachman's teaching, you know, his Hasidim about this, but he's clearly also like, this is something that is clearly a part of his own struggle and his own practice. And something that I want to highlight here is that he is evidently more scared of depression than he is scared of joy. because of what he sees as the impacts of those on your actions in the world, right? He's saying, usually when you're joyful, you're probably going to be you're probably going to be a pretty good person. You know, you're actually like more likely when we're feeling depressed, right? When we're feeling like just like constricted in ourselves, like that's actually the place where we're more likely, that's probably more likely actually gonna lead us to be in our practice and in the world and in relation in some way that we're gonna regret. And the joy thing can also do that. Like sometimes we can get out of hand, but he says explicitly, right, that's less likely. And even there's elsewhere is quoted saying, "Ein davar mazik la'avodat Hashem k'mo atzvus." There's nothing more dangerous to our practice than sadness. Again, like, you know, to our 21st century ears, these 18th century, early 19th century, like it might sound like this kind of simplistic psychology, and maybe it is in some way, according to like our own insights today. But I think we're getting a sense of like, of how they're understanding joy, both its pleasure, but also its capacity to activate us in the world, in our spiritual lives in some way. And so that's where I want to wrap up here, just with a sort of summation here of that what we see, again, like I said in the beginning, that the opposite of joy, it's not so much sadness. The opposite of joy is not so much like being concerned. The opposite of joy is self-absorption, and not being able to actually engage with people and practices, and even like spiritual dimensions beyond ourselves. And so the question to end on, of course, is how do we, who are, I don't think there's a single Hasidic Jew in this room, you know, how do we open up to otherness, and how do we sharpen our attunement to what is not me? I think that's like really the heartbeat here. So I think we have a few minutes. If there's questions or thoughts, I'm very, very interested to just open up for a few minutes here, please.
Probably too late to introduce this, but the opposite of being in service through joy, apathy. Where does apathy enter into this? Too late.
Yeah, no, it's big questions are good questions. So yeah, so I'm trying to think like what the term in the Hasidic sources for what we would think of as apathy. Yeah, or like numbness in some way. That's a really interesting question. I'm like scanning through sermons and stories in my head right now. Apparently they didn't struggle with it as much as we do, or at least they didn't talk about it as much as we do. Oh.
I mean, I think I'm conflating.
What is it in that tradition? Yeah.
Not my top of my mind right now.
So apathy, maybe even in the sense of like equanimity in some way? No, just like more like sort of being like numb or
down,
yeah, unfeeling in some way.
Turning inward, maybe it's really
Yeah.
somewhat.
Yeah, right. One of my favorite characters in the New Inside Out movie. Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for it. Yeah, but sometimes like the absence of it can be illuminating itself. Pablo.
I found in my like very small interactions with Hasidic Jews, there was this also joy in hospitality towards outsiders, which I noticed.
Probably Chabad.
Yeah.
One particular branch of Hasidism that is one of the only ones that's not super insular. And is in many ways an exception that proves the rule. But
yeah. My friend James and I, when I was living in London, we went to Golders Green and deep into some of the very Hasidic neighborhoods there to celebrate Purim. He's a very cultural Jewish guy. He was part of the group that got Jeremy Corbyn in trouble by toasting at a was it Passover celebration, Death Day Israel, but it was all
Yeah.
Jews. And what was very fascinating.
Yeah, that's a whole other interesting facet of Hasidism is that historically they were all completely anti-Zionist.
Oh, yeah.
And still to this day, even like in Jerusalem, if you wander through like Hasidic neighborhoods of Jerusalem, you'll see like extremely aggressive posters and things like that are against the state of Israel and its soldiers.
Yeah, I noticed that the neighborhood he took us to, because his cousins lived in the neighborhood, and it was just interesting because, every house we passed, hey, have you read the scroll yet? And as soon as he said no, they dragged him in. And at first we were just like, well, we're abandoned outside, like me and his Protestant girlfriend, which we didn't mention. But we hung out outside, but they kept bringing us food and drink continuously, to the point where we basically had a feast and they set up tables for us while we were waiting for them to just read the scroll.
Yeah.
And it was incredible because I've never really experienced that.
Yeah, this is
another religious tradition.
That's a super helpful anecdote, and I think it also connects to, like, are there any Hasidic communities like this? And I was like, well, the world is complicated. I think that even the most like ultra, conservative, insular Hasidic communities, like I from what I've heard and understand, they are often that way among themselves, right? Which is not nothing. It's like, I think that kind of hospitality, even people I know who, for like even traumatic reasons, like grew up Hasidic and left and like want nothing to do with it. Like when you talk to many of them, they'll often say, but they're like, there is something I miss, honestly, about like the warmth and like connectedness and hospitality and just the sort of like immersive community feeling that is hard to find in our sort of socially alienated, fragmented world. Yeah, please. Hi.
Thank you. That was very cool. Zebby says hi. He does Seekers of Unity and he's a
Oh, cool. Hi, Zebby.
Yeah. So I was wondering, there's a lot of different practices about what to do, or telling jokes, or doing somersaults, but what's your prescription for us or homework for us to take this joy, like from your own perspective, in a practice?
I love that question.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah, the question is, like, we've seen certain practices, the sort of solitude practice of Rabbi Nachman, the somersaulting practices that were sort of throughout the history of Hasidism, and so on, from these sources that were apparently like, or playing the fool, ways to get out, ways to sort of attain this level of joy. What works for me, or what would I prescribe? I think you said I won't prescribe anything. And I think, and for me, like I feel like it's what works for some doesn't work for others. Like I have this weird thing that I'm like 40 now, and I'm starting to just realize, okay, this is just like a thing in me that whenever I get too into any practice, it ends up feeling depressing to me. So for me, I'll say sometimes, like to recover a sense of joy in our spiritual lives and in our practices, if that's feeling elusive in your practice, like maybe mess it up a bit, maybe play the heretic a little bit. To me, that can be like a very enlivening, vitalizing practice. Dancing for me is like the biggest one of all. For me, it's like any practice that gets me in touch with my body. Also, like whether that's nature, dancing, sex, sometimes meditation, if it doesn't become too intense and it starts depressing me, rivers. Yeah. Yeah. And this maybe should be the last question, just out of respect for time.
Yeah, it's more of a sort of observation. Yes, the body was coming across very strong. There's the spiciness, the laughing, the songs,
yeah.
But also something about in the evolution of the tradition around in terms of the relationship to the idea of a commandment, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe early on that was really necessary. Like, yeah, don't kill people, don't eat shellfish, we better not do these things.
And everything in between.
Right. And then at a certain point, it's like, okay, well, what do you do? Right. There's some shift around maybe the necessity of the law in a very thou shalt not way into something more kind of, well, yeah, what is this life really for? What it's really about? Oh yeah, we're we're not going to be here forever. We should probably try and enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're getting to something that shows up in a lot of Hasidic sources, which is an attentiveness to the danger of any traditional practice. I wrote this whole piece on child mind and Hasidic spirituality, and brought a lot of these sources in where there's this motif of talking about it being in a state of it's not like as ageist as it sounds. They're using these as sort of like psychological categories, but falling into a state of oldness in relation to something, which is basically like when something is just so familiar. You have this, like the 613 commandments, you've been doing them your whole life, you've been reading these sources since you were a kid, and there's an incredible spiritual danger there, which is that you can become, hey, maybe this is the stuff where apathy comes in. Yeah, here it is, what they call oldness, actually. Maybe this is actually where you can just start to, you're just sort of like, you're not moved anymore, right? And so like, what even is this practice anymore? And talking about what it is like to actually bring what they call like an infantile, childlike sense of the unknown, even to things that are part of your traditional practices. And so this was part of their effort to renew Jewish tradition itself and make it something that you can see through like the fresh eyes of an infant in some way. So for them, breaking out of oldness back into a place of infantile mind, of child mind, is certainly not disconnected from the themes of joy we're talking about, and is also part of what I think they mean about like actually doing the practice as not just like heteronymous commandments and laws, but as actually embodying something that's really like springing from your soul in some way. And they love one of their favorite word plays is the word mitzvah, which means commandment. They loved locating tzivui in the same root, which means like to connect yourself, to almost like nail things together, fuse things together. So what is this thing that we're calling a commandment? It's the mechanism of spiritual connection with something deeper and higher. Okay, I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was so enlightening, and I feel really inspired. And I know I'm probably not the only person in the room who feels that way. Thank you so much. The depth of your knowledge is just really visceral. So I feel like I was brought through the container that we set, the transformative container. And thank all of you for coming and engaging so intently and with such open hearts. I am so appreciative of how this room showed up tonight. It was just wonderful. And I want to just invite you all back to the Alembic. We would love to have you here. If you're not on our mailing list, if you want to know about our events, please sign up in the hallway. You can write your email down on the iPad and you'll get our newsletter about once a week with our offerings. You can follow us on Facebook or wherever you like to on social media. And I just wanted to let you know about some upcoming events that we're having here. We have a regular meditation on Tuesdays and on Thursdays. So if you're interested in a regular sit, please come out on one of those days. We also have some fun stuff coming up. This Saturday, we have an equinox party happening here. So if you haven't seen the tickets for that and you're interested, please go ahead and register for that because I think it's gonna be a great time. And then that's on Saturday. On Sunday, we have Soma Nidra, which is like an embodiment class. And she's going to be talking about what's called cellular breath. So really thinking about breath at the like cellular level and on the experiential level. And so Bex will be teaching that, and she's a great teacher. We coming up next week, we have on Wednesday a an art event called VR, like virtual reality models of what it's like to die. And that's going to be an event where David, who's hosting, is kind of speculating about what the process of dying might look like, and has created artistic visuals representing that. And so we're going to explore that together next Wednesday. And then lastly, there's a meditation day long happening on the 29th with Michael Taft, who's a co-founder of the space. And that'll be like just like a full day sit from 10 to 5 p.m. here. So if you're looking to get a taste of meditation and really kind of spend the day sinking in, that's going to be happening at the end of this month. So I hope to see all of you again, and I hope you have a wonderful night. You can hang out in the lobby for a little while, have tea, chat to people, the people in this room. I'll be closing the doors around like 9:10. So yeah, feel free to hang out.